often said, you know, sugars and refined grains are problematic, is becoming sort of standard operating procedure. The question is now, you know, how much people accept the idea that saturated fat will not kill them. Yes.
So what about the paleo craze these days?
Paleo is another variation of carb restriction. So a lot of this, these all have, there's an evolutionary support to all of this, which is two ways to look. So one, we should eat the foods we evolved to eat. And what the paleo people say is, look, we evolved to eat all these foods, and we didn't evolve to eat those foods, and we've only had agriculture for 10,000 years, and therefore we can imagine a sort of ideal human diet. And it's got some tubers, and it's got berries seasonally, and a little bit of eggs, and no dairy, and no... and I mean, that makes sense, except that we evolved in different environments all over the world, and you could even make a, you know, paleo is an interesting idea, but fundamentally it's a diet that's lacking sugar, grains, dairy, vegetable oils, modern foods. And what I'm arguing, what I can stand behind, is I can make an argument that sugar and refined grains are the problem. So you can get rid of sugar and refined grains, and if none of us had any sugar in our diet, we could eat anything we wanted. We could be, you know, vegans, we could live on rice, we could eat anything, we'd be relatively healthy. And whether there's a healthier version and that, you know, we'd be healthier still if we ate what primitive Paleolithic man ate, maybe, but there are no clinical trials to support that. So I'm basically arguing, you know, both of them have this evolutionary background, but I'm saying, to me, what I find compelling is the idea that sugar and refined flour are basically, a highly refined flour, have been in our culture for a couple thousand years, and then they exploded with the Industrial Revolution, and these diseases, obesity and diabetes, exploded with the Industrial Revolution. I actually have diabetes inpatient records from Philadelphia, Pennsylvania Hospital in Philadelphia, which is like the oldest hospital in the country. And they'll do searches for you through their inpatients. In the 1870s, they had years where they had 0 diabetes cases. And you could just see it climbing steadily year after year after year into the 1940s. And today, as you saw, 20 million Americans have diabetes. So you can make a pretty good argument that, for instance, diabetes was virtually non-existent in the United States before the Industrial Revolution, the invention of the confectionery industry and the soft drink industry. Yes?
So in obese people, I know that they have a tendency to have like larger fat cells, also probably quite larger because of the insulin spike, but also they have a greater number. Now,
Wait, you have to speak up a little more.
Oh, they also have a greater number of fat cells. So how do you account for that? Like, just in obesity, like morbidly obese patients, that's usually doing. So.
I mean, one of the drivers of the transformation of pre-adipocytes to adipocytes, I'm going to forget the name. Anyway, if you look up what regulates that particular molecule, it's regulated by insulin. So again, virtually everything I've found that determines fat cell number or size is driven by insulin. And the idea is pretty simple. Insulin is a signaler of the fed state. And it's a response to the carbohydrate in the diet. So when you eat a carb-rich diet, and it stimulates insulin secretion. And then one of the things the insulin is doing is controlling blood sugar. So it's telling the mitochondria in the lean tissue to burn the blood sugar and increasing the flow of blood sugar into the glucose into those cells, but it's also storing fat and some of the carbohydrates so that the fat doesn't get in the way of burning the blood sugar. And then as insulin levels come down, the idea is they allow the fat to come out of the fat tissue and to replace the declining blood sugar for fuel in the lean tissue. And this is part of this fatty acid, it's called the glucose fatty acid cycle. But it makes perfect sense that basically, you know, insulin is the hormone that you want driving fat accumulation in your body. There's another hormone called ASP, acetylstimulating protein, that might play some role in allowing, so the fat that you eat gets stored pretty much immediately. It gets transported across the gut wall into particles called chylomicrons and shuttled off to your fat tissue. And this is one of the reasons why people thought they could blame obesity on dietary fat, because the dietary fat gets stored immediately. And the reason, you can imagine the reason it gets stored immediately is because your body wants to burn the carbohydrates in the diet. The problem is it's the carbohydrates that regulate that fat storage. So even though the fat gets stored first, in an ideal system, it would eventually get burned as well, and you wouldn't accumulate fat with each passing day and year, and that the accumulation of fat is regulated and dysregulated by the carbohydrate content. And I forgot what the question was. I hope I answered.
So I'm wondering, do you believe or know whether or not sugar is a problem even in the presence of fiber?
So you're talking like fruit? Like
Yeah, but I mean, even say you had, processed high fructose corn syrup in some kind of meal that had a significant degree of fiber as well.
Well, it's interesting. I mean, I wonder if one of the problems is just liquid sugar. And if we lived in a population which we never got to drink our sugars, would the sugars be relatively benign? It's a possibility, And again, a lot of this is just based on crazy anecdotal experience. I grew up in a world where we didn't have fruit juices. When I grew up, when I was a young boy, we got our fruit in concentrates, frozen, and you had to defrost it, throw it in the blender, so my father made a thing of orange juice every morning, but that's it. We didn't have cartons of apple juice, bottles of fruit juice, all of that, like 1980s onward. But our favorite snack was bananas and sour cream where we dumped 2 tablespoons of sugar on top. That was fine. And so I wonder if, and the fat would also slow the digestion of the sugar, just like the fiber would. Whereas, so it's not about, one of the messages here, it's not about just the total quantity of what you're consuming, but the speed with which you consume it. So if you think, and this was a point was made in the 1960s by this British guy who should have gotten a lot of credit for this, Peter Cleve, and he said, look, imagine if I want to apply 50 pounds of pressure to your body. Okay, I can do it by leaning on you gently for 10 minutes, or I could do it in a second by punching you. If I lean on you gently for 10 minutes, it'll be mildly disturbing and annoying, but it's not going to cause any chronic harm. If I punch you, it will, especially if I do it 3 times a day for a few months. And what we're doing is, you can think of it as like punching your pancreas and your liver versus leaning on it gently. And the answer is, so I don't actually know what the answer is. It is conceivable that sugar would be harmless under those circumstances. And if we didn't have the liquid sugars, that's what causes the damage. And that's what creates the insulin resistance, which then leads to this entire sequelae of negative problems. So I don't know. But I disagree with Lustig. And we were actually going to write a book together. And this was one of the things, because he likes the idea of sugar with fiber being attached being good, because that's some starches and fruits. But back in the 70s, when we started pushing the fiber thing, and I know too much of the history, once this idea that fiber is good for you. So this guy, Peter Cleve, was saying, look, the cause of all these diseases is the refined sugars in grains in the diet. And he wrote a book about it, and this guy, Dennis Burkitt, who was very famous already, who had been working in Uganda, came back to the United Kingdom, and he needed a job. And he went to Sir Richard Dahl, who was already famous for linking cigarettes to lung cancer, and Dahl said, you should read this guy Peter Cleve's book, it's brilliant. So Cleve was implicating refined grains and sugars in what are called diseases of Western diets. And Dahl read this book, and he said, geez, it's not the presence of the refined grain and sugar that's a problem, it's the absence of fiber. So when you refine the sugar and the flour, what you do is you remove the fiber, and it's the fiber that's necessary. And by the time Burkitt started publishing on this, early 70s, it took like 2 years for it to be embraced, and by 1974, there was an oat bran muffin craze. So the idea was you could just take a terrible diet and eat an oat bran muffin, and it'll somehow mitigate it. So I could have a Coke, eat an oat bran muffin, and a Coke isn't going to do any damage. And I don't believe that's true. But I do believe that if we think that way, then the food industry will figure out a way to put fiber in Coca-Cola and fruit juice, and we won't make any progress. So it's kind of a, you know.
So what is your opinion on fruit, whole fruits and vegetable and storing sugar?
Whole fruit?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, here's my problem with fruit in general. What we want to do is have dietary recommendations for the whole country, for everyone. So you could say, fruits and vegetables are an inherent part of a healthy diet, we should all eat it. We should all get to benefit from whatever these wonderful things fruits do for us. The problem is, one of the messages of this underlying science is that people that are predisposed to get fat are people different than people who aren't. So I can take two people, give them the exact same diet, the exact same energy, exercise regime. One's going to get obese, one's not. Or diabetic and the other's not. It's not about how much they eat, it's about how they respond. Their bodies respond to the macronutrient contents of those diets. And so an apple isn't that different than a potato in terms of it's like you take the same weight and the apple's going to have a little more water, a little less glucose, and a little more sugar. And if you are predisposed to be obese or diabetic, or you are obese or diabetic, then maybe you shouldn't be eating that apple. Whereas if you're lean, you're fine. And so I think if you just look at the macronutrient composition in the apple and what's driving obesity and diabetes, these are not foods that obese and diabetic people should eat if they don't want to be obese and diabetic. And we shouldn't tell them to, and that means we're talking about, if we include overweight, 2/3 of the American public. The other third can be fine. And people don't like it argue that we shouldn't eat fruit. Not the fruit industry, they're not powerful enough. It just seems like, again, I was on the Mehmet Oz show, and Oz was going off about how beautiful these things are, and the deep colors, and how can they not possibly be healthy for you. And if I was really as witty as I would like to think I was, I would have said, Mehmet, this isn't an art appreciation course, we're talking about human health. But it's just, we have come to be convinced that fruits are, I don't know, maybe because, even Eve didn't get healthier by eating more apples. I don't really understand. But I think that's a mistake. And I think that we have to realize that people who get obese and diabetic are different than lean people. And that's a fundamental thing we have to understand.
So, taking into account the pre-World War II studies that we were talking about,
What's that?
the pre-World War II studies about people who were obese, they didn't have drinkable sugar then. There wasn't a lot of soda. So, what is the reasoning behind why they were obese? Is it just
Well, they did have sugar and still had refined grains, and in that part of Europe, they also had beer. But you are going to get some portion of the population is going to be born they had obese children, they just had a lot less of them. So we have an obesity epidemic. But remember, even Hilda Brooke, and again, Europe's hard to tell because they had so many sequential wars and so much famine. But the idea is, even the people who were born predisposed to get obese, had they been born into an environment without easily digestible carbohydrates and some sugars, their predisposition would not have been able to express itself. So if you think about it in terms of genotype and phenotype, but I'm saying the genotype determines your tolerance to the carbohydrate content diet. If that genotype is born into a carb-rich environment, then boom, you get the obese diabetic phenotype. If it's not, but even again, when they were studying it pre-war, there was just a lot less obesity. But there was still significant obesity. And there's also interesting issues about how we perceive of obesity. Because a lot of, back then, if you watch like BBC series like I do, it's poor farmers' wives are always heavy. So why? And they would have argued it was because of the, and I have a quote to this effect, it would have been because of the lipogenic nature of a high-carb diet. They were still relegated to eating a high-carb diet. It wasn't as refined. There wasn't as much liquid sugar. There was some. And there were still people who were sensitive enough that this would trigger them. And as I said, also estrogen actually has the opposite effect of insulin on this Insulin upregulates this hormone lipoprotein lipase that pulls fat into fat tissue. Estrogen suppresses it. So as women go through menopause and they secrete less estrogen, they tend to upregulate LPL on their fat tissue, which has the effect of making them fatter and thicker. And I think that's one of the reasons why these diets don't work as well on women, is because they have more hormones working towards making them store fat than men do naturally. Yes?
What would you say to a person who would like to follow this diet?
Wait, I'm going to have to ask.
Makes them feel so happy. What would you say to a person who believes this, would like to follow the diet, but cake makes them feel so happy?
Does.
It does. The bacon. I mean, imagine, you get through, you know, I could drop dead from a heart attack any minute, but I want to drop dead well fed. I mean, this is, it's, you know, it's interesting. There are people who can't do it because they can't give up their carbohydrates. And one of the arguments that I've always made, I use a metaphor for smoking. I used to, because I'm a journalist, I had the advantage of being a smoker when I was younger. And when you're a smoker, you cannot imagine life without cigarettes. And you smoke, you know, you wake up, you have a cigarette, you eat breakfast, you have a cigarette, you go for a walk, you have a cigarette, you get in the car, you have a cigarette, lunch is a cigarette, phone calls, cigarette, strolls through the park, cigarettes, exercise, post-exercise cigarette. You cannot imagine life without cigarettes. And I believe that carbohydrates, and you could explain it physiologically in the body as much as in the brain, that these create a powerful craving. And if you're obese or diabetic, hyperinsulinemic, you would expect that craving to be such that lean people can't imagine it. And there's a cartoon I saw of an overweight woman walking past a candy store, and she's being like sucked into the candy store, and there's a lean woman next to her who's walking right by. And you could imagine that this phenomenon, I could give you a very good physiological explanation for just that phenomenon. That the overweight, hyperinsulinemic person starts thinking about sugar, and they start over-secreting insulin in response, this sort of Pavlovian phenomenon that's called the cephalic phase of insulin secretion. What that insulin does is start storing the calories in their bloodstream and leaving their cells actually hungrier than it started. The French have a phrase that the appetite begins with the meal. And you can think about this. The next time you sit down to eat, you might not be that hungry when you start eating. And then as you start, you actually get hungrier. And if you have a 4-year-old like I do, you could do this with carbohydrates. It's fascinating. It's like halfway through the meal, they're hungrier than they were when they started. And this can all be explained by insulin secretion. So you can imagine the craving. Why people feel so happy on these diets? It's the flip side. The people do A, because for the first time in their life they can control their weight without starving themselves. There was a New York Times article today about obese doctors and the conflicts they have. And they quoted a bariatric surgeon at New York University Hospital who had to have bariatric surgery himself because he weighed 300 pounds. And he got down to 210. And in the article it said with the bariatric surgery he now maintains his 210-pound weight eating 800 calories a day. Now I don't believe that's possible, and I actually have a note to track this guy down and interview him and find out how he knows he consumes 800 calories a day, but it could be. But what's fascinating is that's constant semi-starvation. So now if he ate a diet that didn't have, the thing with these diets is they don't regulate how much you eat. They just tell you not to eat carbohydrates. So there are a lot of people who find these liberating because for the first time in their life they can control their weight without this semi-starvation, without thinking about food all the time. One of the researchers in this business, Steve Finney at UC Davis, says without the intrusive thoughts of food that we all have when we're trying to diet. So a common phenomenon. It's funny, back when the American Heart Association tried to sort of kill the Atkins diet as a fad with a critique of it, they pointed out that a side effect of the diet was anorexia, lack of hunger. So you can, it's crazy, right? But this was considered like you're obese, you get to go on this diet and lose weight and you're not hungry, and that's a negative side effect and a reason why you shouldn't do it. But anyway, so I think people, you know, a lot of people have trouble going on it because they have to break this addiction, just like I tried to quit smoking every day for 20 years before I finally succeeded. And a lot of people, when they do go on it, and there's also some sense of euphoria, that there's some people get what's called the Atkins flu, where they feel enervated, nausea. That appears to be an electrolyte problem that can be dealt with by supplementing salt and potassium in the diet. And some people feel this euphoria that might be an effect of the ketones that are produced, might be effective just freely burning the fat that you store. Yes?
We learned a lot that glucose is the primary fuel for the brain and everything, but then when you stop eating carbohydrates, you're not going to have all that glucose. Instead, you're going to have ketones.
Well, it's interesting because some people predict, so the idea is glucose, when your brain, in a carb-rich environment, your brain it needs 120 to 130 grams of glucose a day, and this is often perceived as a reason why you have to have carbohydrates in the diet. And sometimes you'll see things like, you know, so people assume that without carbohydrates in the diet, you'll have cognitive defects. And I always want to say, wait, I wrote this book without. And then they'll say, see. The point is, you do not need 120, 30 grams of carbs. That's what your brain burns in a when you're eating carb-rich meals. If you remove the carbs from your diet, your fat that you are now burning, which is what you want to do with your fat, right, is burn it. That fat will be converted to ketones, and your brain will use about 2/3 of the fuel that it needs. It'll get from ketones and glycerol that's released with the fatty acids when you break down the fat in your fat tissue. And then about 1/3 of the fuel you'll get from glucose, which is converted from protein. And if you're eating unless you're semi-starving, then you're getting enough protein in your diet to provide the remaining glucose that you need without any trouble from the protein in your diet. You don't have to break down your muscles to do it. So you do not, and so this is just a technical error. Whenever you read that the brain needs 120 to 30 grams of carbohydrates, it uses that if carbs are the primary fuel. And then there's studies suggesting that both the brain and like the heart muscle, which prefers fatty acids, run more efficiently on fatty acids and ketones, which could be one reason why people feel so good. Those people who are happy on the diet feel good with the diet. But wait, you've already asked the
I asked
question.
one, you can go.
This is a quickie. When you say, when you're talking about a low-carb diet, what percentage of calories and carbohydrates are you talking about?
Okay, interesting question. What's the definition of a low-carb diet? So, just to differentiate, so the first thing I'm arguing is that it's the carbohydrate content of the diet that makes us fat. Different issue from how much carbs can you eat and lose weight if you're overweight, obese. And that's an interesting issue. There are people in this field who think that in order to feel good, be happy on these diets, you have to be in ketosis, which means about, less than 60 grams of carbohydrates a day, depending on body. And if that's true, not many people can do that. It's actually very difficult to do unless you